Good to see some familiar faces. First of all, I just want to start by saying, anytime you're asked to return to a place that you helped build, you had a hand in building, it's special.
Nobody saw the ultimate betrayal coming until the ink was already dry on the contract, completely shifting the balance of power in the league. The Indiana Fever had just wrapped up one of the most historic, record-shattering seasons in the entire history of women's basketball, dragging a historically struggling franchise out of the dark ages and back into the playoff spotlight where they once belonged. Fans were ecstatic. The merchandise was flying off the shelves at unprecedented rates, and it genuinely felt like the organization had finally found its permanent footing after years of miserable irrelevance and draft lottery heartbreak. The young core was developing undeniable chemistry. The offensive system was starting to click, and the city of Indianapolis had entirely embraced this new era of basketball. But behind closed doors, hidden from the cheering crowds and the glowing media narratives, a massive storm was brewing. One that would completely upend the roster, shatter the illusion of a perfectly happy locker room, and force the team's biggest star into a highly uncomfortable, high-stakes reality. Just when absolutely everyone thought the exhausting drama of the rookie season was firmly in the rearview mirror and the team could finally get some rest, the front office dropped a sudden bombshell that sent absolute shockwaves through the entire sports world. Christy Sides, the head coach who had weathered an unimaginable media circus, taken the heavy criticism on the chin, and ultimately guided the team to their first postseason appearance in nearly a decade, was unceremoniously shown the door. It was a ruthless, cold-blooded business decision that proved the organization was no longer satisfied with simply participating. They wanted to dominate. But the real earthquake didn't hit when Sides was fired. It hit when the front office announced her highly controversial replacement. In her place, the franchise proudly announced the arrival of a name that instantly made die-hard fans' blood boil and caused a deafening, highly noticeable silence from the team's franchise player. They had gone out and hired Stephanie White, the brilliant but notoriously gritty mastermind who had just spent the last several months orchestrating a brutal, physically exhausting, and incredibly aggressive defensive campaign against Caitlin Clark. This wasn't just a simple coaching change meant to tweak the offensive playbook. To many inside the building, it felt dangerously close to sleeping with the enemy. Stephanie White was the head coach of the Connecticut Sun, the exact team that had served as the ultimate villain in the Fever's story all season long. As the chaotic news rapidly broke across social media platforms and sports networks, the newly appointed president of basketball operations, Kelly Krauskopf, found herself immediately scrambling to contain a massive internal crisis. Krauskopf had to act quickly, ultimately exposing the shocking truth about Caitlin Clark's biggest problem with her new head coach before the rumors could tear the locker room apart. But that wasn't the whole story, because the toxic roots of this incredibly awkward dynamic actually started months before anyone even knew a front office change was coming. Dating back to the very first time, these two opposing forces clashed on a professional basketball court. To truly understand the intense gravity and danger of this current situation, you have to look deeply at exactly what happened during Caitlin's grueling rookie campaign, specifically when she went head-to-head with White's defensive schemes. The transition from college basketball to the professional ranks is notoriously brutal for any player. But what this particular young star faced was entirely unprecedented in the history of the sport. Opposing teams didn't just play hard, traditional defense against her, they launched a systematic, highly coordinated campaign of physical intimidation meant to test her breaking point. It was a literal baptism by fire, complete with cheap shots away from the ball, incredibly hard screens designed to leave bruises, and borderline flagrant fouls that dominated the national headlines week after week. And absolutely no team in the league embodied this aggressive, intentionally hostile strategy more effectively than the Connecticut Sun. Under the direct, unapologetic leadership of Stephanie White, The Sun completely transformed into a terrifying defensive juggernaut that seemed to take absolute pleasure in making the rookie's life a living nightmare on the hardwood. White designed complex defensive traps that forced the ball out of Clark's hands, utilizing intense full-court pressure that exhausted the young guard before she could even cross the half-court line. Every single time the Fever matched up against Connecticut, it was significantly less of a traditional basketball game, and significantly more of a grueling heavyweight brawl. The absolute peak of this hostility, the moment that fractured the relationship between the two franchises, occurred during the opening round of the highly anticipated playoffs, a series that will forever be burned into the minds of angry Indiana fans. During that incredibly tense playoff series, the physicality reached a boiling point that sent social media into an absolute frenzy. In a highly controversial, heavily debated moment that changed the entire tone of the postseason, Connecticut's Dejounte Carrington poked Caitlin directly in the eye. A devastating play that somehow went uncalled by the referees and left the rookie visibly shaken, bruised, and struggling to see. The blatant lack of protection from the officials was one incredibly frustrating thing, but the overarching narrative that emerged from that series was completely undeniable. Stephanie White's team was more than willing to push the absolute boundaries of the rulebook to permanently break the rookie's spirit. They trapped her in the corners, they bullied her in the paint, they aggressively swarmed her on the perimeter, and they ultimately ended her magical rookie season in devastating fashion. For the Indiana front office to turn around just a few weeks later, fire their own coach, and hand the ultimate keys of the franchise over to the exact woman who orchestrated that very nightmare was a massive plot twist nobody saw coming. It felt like a massive slap in the face to a player who had just given everything physically and mentally to elevate the franchise. And what happened next would shock everyone, as the cold, harsh reality of this front office decision began to set in inside the heavily guarded Fever practice facility. The silence from the franchise player in the immediate aftermath of the hiring announcement was incredibly deafening, and it didn't take long for the real, deeply rooted issues to leak out to league insiders. Kelly Krauskopf didn't just return to the front office from her stint with the NBA's Pacers to make friends or maintain the status quo. She came back with a singular mission to build a dynasty, and she knew instantly that she had a massive, raging fire to put out. Through intense, highly secretive behind-the-scenes discussions, Krauskopf uncovered the brutal, unavoidable reality of the situation. Caitlin's biggest problem with Stephanie White wasn't necessarily just the physical battery she endured in the playoffs, though that eye poke certainly left a deeply bitter taste that wouldn't easily wash away. The real, fundamental issue was a deep-seated lack of trust and a terrifying question of loyalty that threatened to derail the upcoming season before it even began. All season long, the rookie had felt largely unprotected, incredibly isolated, and hung out to dry by her previous head coach. When she was getting violently shoved to the ground, unfairly targeted by rival players with obvious vendettas, and verbally battered in the hostile press conferences, she rarely saw Christy Sides taking a massive fine, slamming a table in anger, or truly going to war for her in the media. Sides tried to play the role of the diplomat, constantly telling her team to ignore the noise and play through the contact. But that passive approach deeply alienated her superstar. Now, that same superstar was being asked to fully trust a new coach whose entire reputation in the fiercely competitive league was built on defensive grit, the exact kind of ruthless grit that had just been weaponized to terrorize her. Krauskopf quickly realized that if she didn't intervene immediately, if she let these deep resentments simmer in the shadows, the locker room would entirely fracture before training camp even opened its doors. She had to take drastic measures, actively facilitating raw, entirely unfiltered conversations between the young phenom and the veteran coach, forcing them to sit down and address the massive elephant in the room face to face. The president of basketball operations had to look her star directly in the eyes and assure her that the very ruthlessness White used against her in the playoffs would now be entirely repurposed and weaponized to protect her. It was a massive psychological hurdle to overcome, and convincing a fiercely competitive, highly stubborn player to blindly trust her former tormentor was a delicate, high-wire act of epic proportions. White had to thoroughly explain her tactical mindset, proving that the brutal defense wasn't personal, but rather the ultimate sign of respect for how dangerous the rookie truly was on the court. But getting past the lingering bad blood and hurt feelings was only the very tip of the iceberg when it came to their inevitable, highly anticipated clash on the hardwood. Because once the emotional hurdles were cleared, they still had to figure out how to actually play the game of basketball together without driving each other absolutely crazy. Basketball purists and analytical experts immediately identified a catastrophic tactical nightmare looming on the horizon, one that heavily threatened to derail the team's offense completely, if not handled with extreme care. You don't have to be a basketball genius or a seasoned scout to see that Caitlin's preferred style of play is wildly chaotic, heavily reliant on instincts, and entirely built on pushing the tempo to its absolute limits. Her entire offensive philosophy involves launching deep transition threes before the opposing defense can even set up, throwing high-risk, needle-threading passes, and turning every single game into a relentless, exhausting track meet. It is a highly entertaining system built on absolute freedom, creative expression, and living with a few frustrating turnovers in exchange for explosive, game-altering offensive runs that demoralize the opponent. Stephanie White, on the exact opposite hand, operates on the complete other end of the strategic basketball spectrum. During her highly successful tenure in Connecticut, she ran a remarkably rigid, heavily structured half-court, grit-and-grind system. She demanded absolute defensive perfection on every single possession, intentionally slowed the pace of the game down to a suffocating, muddy crawl, and heavily prioritized physical post play over run-and-gun perimeter antics. Forcing these two entirely contrasting basketball philosophies to merge together is exactly like trying to mix oil and water during a hurricane. The undeniable, terrifying fear inside the organization is that White will naturally try to put a restrictive leash on the young guard, forcing her to run highly structured, slow-developing half-court sets that completely neutralize her generational talent and turn her into a standard, ordinary point guard. If White tries to heavily micromanage the offense from the sidelines and strips away the joyous freedom that made the rookie a global phenomenon in the first place, the underlying tension will absolutely explode into a full-blown, highly public feud that the media will feast on. Krauskopf had to sit both of these incredibly stubborn women down and expertly mediate a massive compromise, directly demanding that White adapt her stubborn, old-school coaching style to actually fit the strengths of the roster, while simultaneously challenging her young star to finally buy into a significantly more disciplined, exhausting defensive effort. It is an incredibly fragile, highly delicate compromise that could easily shatter into a million pieces the absolute moment a three-game losing streak hits and the pressure mounts. However, this looming tactical nightmare surprisingly pales in comparison to the massive locker room division that was already quietly beginning to take shape right under the front office's noses, involving the other highly crucial pieces of the championship puzzle. While absolutely all eyes were heavily glued to the fascinating, highly tense dynamic between the star guard and the new head coach, the rest of the roster was quietly watching the drama unfold from the sidelines. And the stakes for them couldn't possibly be any higher. The Indiana Fever are absolutely not a one-woman basketball team, and the absolute worst-case scenario for Krauskopf is creating a deeply divided locker room, where players are unfairly forced to choose sides in a quiet civil war. Aaliyah Boston, a generational post player and former #1 overall pick in her own right, had just started finding a deeply devastating, highly effective rhythm in the pick-and-roll game during the second half of the season. She desperately needs a highly stable, completely drama-free environment to continue her upward trajectory, not a massive power struggle between the perimeter players and the sidelines. Furthermore, the situation surrounding NaLyssa Smith has become incredibly complicated, with cryptic social media posts and obvious dissatisfaction regarding her playing time, heavily hinting at a fractured relationship with the organization. White has to somehow repair these fractured relationships, figure out the optimal front court rotation, and keep everyone bought into the system. But the absolute most terrifying domino waiting to fall in this entire chaotic saga is the incredibly high-stakes, impending free agency of Kelsey Mitchell, a situation that could genuinely make or break the entire franchise's future in an instant. Mitchell is the undisputed veteran heart and soul of the offense, a highly lethal, incredibly fast scorer who completely bought into the new run-and-gun system last year and was absolutely instrumental in their late-season surge to the playoffs. She is currently an unrestricted free agent, meaning she holds all the cards, and she is actively watching exactly how this controversial coaching transition is being handled by the front office. If she senses even a tiny fraction of locker room dysfunction, or if the new offensive system suddenly shifts in a way that drastically marginalizes her scoring role just to comfortably accommodate the new coach's defensive, post-heavy schemes, she has absolutely every reason to pack her bags and sign a massive contract with a ready-made championship contender. Losing Mitchell for absolutely nothing in free agency would be a completely catastrophic failure for the front office, heavily setting the franchise back multiple years and instantly turning the notoriously passionate fanbase entirely against the new regime. Krauskopf knows perfectly well that keeping the fragile peace between her point guard and her new head coach isn't just about winning a few extra regular season games. It's about definitively proving to the rest of the league that Indiana is a highly stable, premier destination, not a deeply dysfunctional circus. White has to confidently walk into that locker room on day one and instantly command respect without alienating the exact players who just bled for each other to finally reach the playoffs. But keeping the highly sensitive players happy internally is absolute child's play compared to the absolute media firestorm waiting for them just outside the arena walls. The modern WNBA media landscape has rapidly transformed into an incredibly volatile, deeply toxic environment, and successfully navigating it requires a high level of political savvy and public relations mastery that the previous coaching staff simply did not possess. Every single quote delivered in a press conference, every minor rotation change during the second quarter, and every subtle eye roll caught on the bench by the television cameras is instantly analyzed, viciously clipped out of context, and aggressively debated by millions of angry people online. During the rookie's highly publicized first year, the media circus was incredibly suffocating and deeply exhausting for everyone involved. Rival players were constantly taking blatant, deeply personal shots in press conferences. Former legends of the game were constantly offering highly unsolicited, deeply critical opinions, and the overarching narrative constantly shifted away from basketball and toward controversy, race, and social politics. Christy Sides often looked exactly like a terrified deer in the headlights when facing the microphone after a tough loss, consistently failing to effectively control the narrative and constantly leaving her players completely exposed to the absolute worst of the media wolves. This is exactly where the true, ultimate test of Stephanie White's controversial hiring will be judged by the front office and the fans. Krauskopf explicitly brought White back to Indiana because she has a well-earned, highly respected reputation for being fiercely protective of her players and utterly, completely unfazed by immense media pressure. When White was heavily defending the incredibly physical, borderline dirty play of her Connecticut squad last season, she did it with a quiet, menacing confidence that instantly shut down aggressive reporters and completely protected her locker room from outside criticism. Now she is being explicitly tasked with bringing that exact same fierce, uncompromising energy